Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to Small Islands Big Conversations with the Institute for Small Islands. My name is Caroline Mair-Toby, and I'm the founder and director of the Institute. And I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Roberto Múkaro Borrero, who is joining us here from the United States. And we are currently in Trinidad, I'd like to say. And so welcome, Mr. Borrero.
Thank you so much for having me, Caroline. I really appreciate being here and having this opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so wonderful to have you here. And we had this wonderful conversation last week. And I would like to invite you to go and check out that interview if you have not. I've given a full, detailed introduction to Mr. Borrero and his many achievements. And I just want to kind of jump right in here, Mr. Borrero, if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Not a problem at all.
Okay. So I want to pause a moment on the fact that you are a Cacique. How many years have you been a Cacique?
Well, I was formally, I had a ceremony to formalize the title in 2012, and ceremonies took place on the island of Boriquén or Puerto Rico, as well as in the United States. And it was known, we described it as an investiture ceremony, meaning that the community was investing in me the tools for leadership, as our ancestors have done and in times past. And so it was a big decision for me to accept when the community was asking me to take on the role. This is not something that someone just applies to themselves and runs with it. If you're following the traditional protocols, really it's the elder women in the community who kind of make that decision upon leadership, and they make that request. And like in other decisions, you always have the opportunity to say no. And I had said no previously because it's a big responsibility. It's not something that I take lightly, or I know it's not something that my ancestors took lightly, because you're really representing a community and a people, ideals, and you're really trying to find a way to keep these things, this way of life and thought into the future. So it puts some additional strain, considerable strain on your family, because you're essentially becoming another family member, an integral family member to many other people. And you have to deal with also the political ramifications of this type of movement in your life, and meaning that once you put yourself out there, or once it's kind of identified, that you have this title, you're open, like any other political figure, in a way you're open to attacks and things of that nature. So it took a little bit of a while. I discussed this with my wife Jocelyn and my family. My daughters were much younger at the time, so they didn't know really much of what was going on. They were just happened to be a part of it. My son was a little older, but we did discuss it, and finally I decided to say yes. And it was really under the with the understanding that I would continue for a certain amount of years. Then we would kind of see where we were at as a community and decide if they wanted me to continue in this role or not. And as I said, this began in officially in 2012, and I still retain the title for the Guainía community today. And I'm very proud of that. And a leader is not just somebody who just, in this sense, using that term cacique. It's really the term also talks about our cosmovision, about the importance of the sun. It really means sun covered, like a blessing from the sun, and that's what the term translates to. And it's really about taking that role, that guidance role, but always being available to listen and to work with the community to find ways forward. And so that doesn't mean tyrannical rule, or it means speaking with people and really trying to build consensus as best you can. And so I feel that that's the way our conducted themselves, and so I try to hold these ideals today.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell me a little bit more? You mentioned the elder woman make the decision. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there's a story in Taino culture that talks about a particular man um, uh, named by Guayahona, and he had gotten into some issues, and in other words, that he wasn't the best role model around. And as a result of that, he also suffered some trials and tribulations. Kind of like you get what you give type of thing.
Yeah.
And so he was in a bad shape physically, and he was near the end of his lifeline, and there appeared to him um, a woman. And there's some talk in the community as if she was more of a spirit deity or an actual woman, but
Mm-hmm.
we call her Guabonito. And she came and she took him to a place that's called a guanara. It means like a place apart. And she conducted a ceremony for him, and healed him of his wounds. And at the end of that trial and that healing that he went through, she presented him with some particular uh, items and implements that would um, convey the leadership responsibility that he was walking into. And
Yeah.
that came with a bit of a change of his name as well. In other words, it was like a new birth for him. And then following that, he becomes more of a cultural hero. And so there's this idea that in the story of redemption for people, of
Mm-hmm.
healing, of the role of the woman who conveys these articles of leadership onto this man. And so after he goes through those ceremonies, then he receives this new name, and he's kind of identified as one of the first caciques, right? And so that's the story. So when we come now to this time, that role of Guabonito, is really about these women coming together again, making this decision like Guabonito did back in those days, and then presenting to this potential leader these certain implements and artifacts and just tools for leadership. So among those that was presented was a guanin, which is a kind of a medallion, a gold type medallion. Our people were used to gold and copper, and they worked with those materials at that time. And that gold medallion um, actually was a symbol of leadership, even more than a headdress or anything else.
Yeah.
That was really conveyed. I'm sorry I don't have mine here handy.
I was gonna
Uh,
ask
I,
you, where is it? Where's the gold medallion?
I'll have to go to another room to get it, and I could show it to you. Um,
Okay.
so if
Yeah.
we take a break, I'll run and get it so you could see it. But that's one of the things. Other were implements used for ceremonial rattle, which we call
Mm-hmm.
maraca, which is not a Spanish
Yes,
word,
yeah.
but a Taino word.
We have those in
And
Trinidad, yes.
yes, and some of the other communities they also call it a shak,
Mm-hmm.
but we call it a maraca in our language. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's there's items like this that are presented, and that's like the symbols of leadership. So that's where that connection to the elder women in the community comes in.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. And so not quite matrilineal, but matrifocal, perhaps?
Yes, I think that there's a lot of discussion about matrilineal culture and what that means, and
Mm-hmm.
there's these days because there's this real understanding of the negative and the devastating effects of European patriarchy, right, upon us white, that links in with
Yeah.
racism and white supremacy, that people have also, in my view, also elevated this ideal of matriarchy and the idea of what that is. From my perspective and in discussions with the community, what I understand is that matriarchy in our community has to do more with genealogy, meaning the lines of the leaders of the community, meaning following a leadership line when there was that
Hmm.
real focus on hereditary leadership, and how that is conveyed. But it wasn't that the women were ruling the community, or
Hmm.
who had the, in other words, that um, the communities really didn't have like really this dictatorial position,
Yeah.
right? And it would be on either
Kind of a
side.
balance and a
Yeah, I
council and
think
a
that our communities
community.
we're striving more for balance, and you see that in everything that Taino culture presents, from the art to the way that we worked on things. And yes, most oftentimes you would see males in the role of cacique, but there are times in the historical record that show also that there were some women. This is not a
That's
widespread, but there were
beautiful.
also women caciques who were very well respected. And the Spaniards didn't respect them that much, but within the communities from our side, the
Yeah.
indigenous side, yes. So again, um, I think that we have to be careful with the trends, and for
Yeah.
us as indigenous peoples, not to push things even further out of balance with kind of ideals that are more influenced by what's going on today than our actual culture, right? So I think that rather
Hmm.
than focusing on one, although yes, you know totally there would be no no hesitation about the role and the importance of women in our community. I just think that as a Taino, we are more concerned with balance, and that's why the women had that role in choosing that leadership. So even if it was hereditary, they would still have to acknowledge that, and they would still have to be sanctioned, right, by them. And so but at the end of the day, the leader of a community is also endowed as a result of that sanctioning to be a leader in decision making as well, and not to exclude consultation, not to exclude um, the idea of community coming together to discuss, but the leadership roles have to be respected for what they are, and just like any other role in the community has to be
Hmm.
respected. All people have to be respected. That's really a foundation of
So
Taino
pure
culture.
meritocracy, earning it, no matter who
Yes,
you are, basically.
I would say so, and at
Hmm.
least that's how I learned about it, and I haven't really seen anything to change my mind in another way.
Hmm. So tell me about your journey, if you don't mind me asking. How did you, because you have, I'm pulling up the list now, you have spoken to the UN, you have spoken so on behalf of the International Indian Treaty Council, you served as the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change North American Indigenous Delegation Coordinator to the UNFCCC's, the UN climate change negotiations. For those who don't know, COP21, that's the big meeting that's all over the news, held in Paris in 2015. And that was the big conference, that was the Paris Agreement. So, tell me how you also served as a co-moderator for the first historic activity of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform under the UNFCCC, which is an outcome of the Paris Agreement. So how did you are Cacique Borrero, you are, you. How did you end up there? How did you start there? Did you start out thinking I was going to be a cacique and talk to the
No,
UN?
not at all. And as I said,
Because you're
even
an artist, aren't you, and a
yeah,
musician?
I started out more as like many others that come through our communities. I feel that I was fortunate in that I was told from my family at a very young age about my heritage, so that seed was planted. that doesn't mean that it really affected much of my life, meaning as a kid who wants to grow up and be like everybody else and not be singled out or things like that of that nature. Although sometimes, we do get singled out, with racism and other things. And I did experience that as a person of color and going through life. And I
Was
remember
that
one
in
incident
Borican or in the US? Sorry.
in the U.S. Yeah, and I remember one kid just not even understanding like what I was. In other words, like, you're not
What are you?
black, you're not, what are you? Like who, just, and they were so angry about it, right? And
Yeah,
and
angry.
so it's interesting, but I think that for me, one incident that happened in high school in the U.S. Um, that really kind of set me on a path to at least look more into my heritage was when they got into this discussion about Columbus. It was like, well, Columbus came over in 1492, and then the next thing you know, we were talking about the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayas, and others, and really the whole section of that Caribbean encounter was not seen as relevant, right? Our story was
Yeah.
erased. So I remember questioning that in school, and then the teacher saying, "Well, that's because those people got wiped out. They didn't really make any contributions," and that really surprised me. And I said,
Yeah.
"Well, that's not true because, I'm from this heritage," and it set up a little incident, and
What did the teacher say? What did the teacher say?
well, they said, "Well, you're mistaken," and things like that. So yeah, and this is not something is an isolated incident over the years.
That's a
I've
that's
heard.
a powerful thing for a young person to hear. You are mistaken. You don't exist anymore. Like,
And you
how?
imagine,
What impact did that have?
well, it made me very angry, right? It made me
Yeah.
very angry. It also really impacted my view of the educational system, meaning how could they say this? But it also sets up a dilemma in your mind because, as you say, you mentioned this idea of matriarchy and here in my family, respecting my mother and my grandmother, who were among those who told me about my heritage. Although my grandmother was not a college educated person, she did know many other things and had many other attributes that
From her own
indicated
experience of life.
right,
Yes.
and she was a smart person.
Yeah.
And but so when you go to school, right, your parents would tell you, okay, go to school, behave yourself, remember, listen to the teacher. They set them up as these authority figures in a way, and you're supposed to give them respect. But when you hear something like that, it also sets up a dilemma in your mind because we're also taught to see our family with respect and reverence. And then so you're saying, okay, so the teacher's telling me that this is basically a lie, what my family was saying, that we really don't have this heritage. And then I'm looking back at my grandmother or my mother and thinking, well, here I am supposed to respect them and what they tell me is the truth, but yet I'm also supposed to respect this teacher. It sets up like a little conflict in your mind. However,
Wow. Yeah.
at least I didn't fall for that conflict, and I was very adamant that no, that you're the one who's mistaken, and we are, you know, the descendants of those people who Columbus met. And so I kind of after that, you know, it, that incident stayed with me for a while, but honestly, I didn't really do anything more with it for quite some time. And
Mhm.
I had my own personal demons to wrestle with over the years that are also probably linked to in some way the effects of colonialism, I would imagine, and how we see ourselves, and not being seen or having our story erased, and you know being seen as an other in many instances. So I'm sure that's all played into it, as among other things. But later on, as I started to get a little bit older and started to venture out and encounter other indigenous peoples, um, I never really had an issue with other indigenous peoples, like kind of saying, hey, where are you from, who are your people, or things like that. I never
Mhm.
felt really so adequate because I didn't really. I knew I had those seeds planted, but it's not like they sit you down and say, here are your Taino lessons or here are your indigenous lessons. You just kind of
You have to find it.
And plus you have to pick up what's going on around you and seeing that even if it's not outward teachings, the foods that we cook, the things that we do, these are linked back to our indigenous heritage. And even if we're not saying that overt, we are getting the lessons, and we are connecting to things in that way. It's just, we're just too distracted to realize it with the state of the world. So as I started coming into more contact with other indigenous peoples, being invited to ceremonies and things like that, I felt a real need to try to reach out to my own folks. And slowly but surely, I would meet other Tainos at the festivals and other cultural activities that happened and that were occurring. And I connected to larger movements of people, organizations, and associations, and that really started me on my way. But I didn't go to school for this. I was very against school, actually, in my younger years because of the experiences that I had. I felt that it was just really, like this process to assimilate us even further. So I had these very radical ideas. Well, I guess what could be considered radical now, some people are thinking that that's really not radical, and really the response that we should have to colonialism and and the efforts to decolonize ourselves, right?
Not
And that's
radical at all. No.
that's really what it's about, right? It's about this constant decolonization process of self, of community, and of others. So right around the end of the 90s, into the early 1990s, the UN was deciding to celebrate, or commemorate rather, um, the first international year of the world's indigenous peoples. And this was happening right around the quincentennial celebrations uh, for Columbus. And
Yes.
what
Yes.
happened is as far as I understand how the story went from the inside, is that the country of Spain had proposed, the UN often does these international years and international decades as a way to focus on certain issues. So it didn't start out with an international year of the world's indigenous peoples. It actually started out with the idea from Spain to talk about kind of commemoration of the quincentennial of the discovery of the Americas. And when they proposed that, a number of countries objected to that because of the institution of slavery, the genocide committed against indigenous peoples, and so that idea was nixed. And instead, they decided to focus on a year for indigenous peoples, but to not cause too much embarrassment for the country. Instead of holding this observance for indigenous peoples in 1992, which is when the 500th anniversary was, they decided to do that in the following year, so that that focus was not on Spain in that way, right? And so that was I understand, was the compromise, and they moved forward on that. And there was various NGOs, and for folks who don't know what NGOs are, those are non-governmental organizations that were kind of activated to be involved in this international year of the world's indigenous peoples. And so they started to have meetings across the street from the UN. They have what they call the UN Church Center there, and there's a lot of activities that go on. And these NGOs do a lot of, I guess, essentially lobbying and awareness raising and things around, because government officials come there, and this is a way to hopefully affect or bring their issues to the forefront. So NGOs work in these capacities, and they started organizing these meetings around the year. And so some of our folks had heard about this, and it was expensive for folks to come from the islands to participate just for these meetings that went on monthly. And so because I started developing some notoriety in the community for artwork and things.
Notoriety.
Yeah, I guess people were starting to, they kind of knew that I was there in New York, So
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was asked by elders in the community if I could attend the meetings and then report back to them on
Mm-hmm.
what was happening and how they could be a part of it somehow. So I started going to those meetings, but really with upfront right away, I said, well, I don't know anything about the UN, nothing about politics, and I have really had no head for that at all. But I went and
How
I
old were
started.
you at that point?
He's probably he's you know 90, 93, 93, maybe in my 20s, 30s, or
Oh,
mid
wow. So yeah,
well,
yeah. So you're
and
not thinking about a diplomatic career at that
yeah,
point.
no, so I I started going to the meetings and just listening, and there was some other persons who had been involved in advocacy from other nations, not from my nation, but a number of folks really, for some reason, took a liking to me and started working with me and inviting me to more activities, and so I really kind of ended up rearranging my life and my lifestyle around this and learning this and going and starting to visit more communities. So it was really not only my own people but other indigenous people, elders and community leaders who really mentored me at that time and brought me into the process and really helped me to better understand some things that I knew or some things that were inherent in me that did not come to the surface before, but somehow I
Mm,
knew them and instinctively or ancestrally, and then really to learn a lot of new things about how to engage in this type of process. So I was invited to many not only indigenous gatherings, but also interfaith gatherings and others where they would invite indigenous peoples, and I would see how that interaction between religious and faith leaders would take place, and that really impacted me. And so little by little, I started to be more involved, even with my own community, trying to take some of what I learned and bring it back to the folks. And so it was either imparting that information or really working, trying to work in building others who were in the diaspora and link them with community members and really build up a cultural base also in the diaspora. But
mhm.
this was never something that was done in isolation from the islands. I
Mhm.
really, the jobs that I took at that time were really jobs to get by, just financially and but also allowed me some flexibility so that I could do a lot of traveling. And I would go back to Boriking as many as 4 times a year to participate in various cultural events or meetings or gatherings. And at this time, we really didn't know anything about the grant writing process. And we weren't even for a very long time after that, we were not even able to really access that process because
No.
nobody knew where to put
Mm-mm.
us, right? Were
Yeah.
we American Indians? Were we Latinos? Were we, so this all became, I mean, from our standpoint, we're indigenous peoples. We're Taino, and that comes before any other community that came in or intermixed with us. That we have that biological connection to those people who were on the islands before the Europeans, and so
Mhm.
that is our main point, right, to our
Yeah.
self-determination. And so at that time, everything was really our own fundraising, our own, working for a couple of weeks, making that money and go and using your own money to be involved in this. I don't know, if the culture today would really allow something like that to happen for many, but it was what was going on back then. So, I really relied on folks from the community to, when I did arrive on the island or islands, uh, people would put me up in their homes and introduce me to community members, and I would go and riding around with folks, and so it was really a communal effort to help build those skills and that understanding and that cultural confidence, right, and that
Yeah.
cultural competency, right. So it
Mhm.
really had to be an investment from both my side and the community side, and so eventually, um, it leads you up into where we are now. And since then, my ideas and understanding have changed. I did go back to college later on in life, and I tell my kids now go
Mhm.
early because it's a pain in the neck when you go later. And so I did go receive some schooling because I understood that if I wanted to access some of these kind of ivory tower institutions like museums and make some kind of dent in the academic understanding of what happened in the Caribbean, in particular to indigenous peoples, I would have to have some, some academic training in that way.
Because they wouldn't
I
listen
was
to you otherwise, basically.
right. We wouldn't have it, right? They wouldn't listen, and that's really what happened to a lot of our folks. That we always knew
Mm-hmm.
that we were here, but many of the history books say that we were wiped out within the first 50 years of conquest, right? Of that colonial
Yeah,
period. And
yeah.
when you really look at the history and look at it with an open mind and trying to understand the both sides of the story, you really see that there's been a lot of manipulation in the academic record
Oh my
uh,
God, so much, so much,
to
so much,
make it
so
look
much.
like
Yeah.
you don't exist. And really, um, I'll give you an example. In 1898,
Hmm.
when the U.S. Came in, they were the second wave of colonization that hit the island after the Spaniards. It was the U.S. under the guise of liberation. They just took over the colony, right? And they did a survey, meaning that they wanted to go around and see what resources, the spoils of the conquest, right? What resources are on the island. So they do a kind of an assessment, a census, and they really found that only in that time period, only 2 to 3% of the entire population of the island in 1898 was what they would term literate, meaning they could read and write, or read or write, or one or the other, right? And so this history that was being promoted in the academic realm by these scholars, who were they really speaking to, right? They
Mm-hmm.
weren't speaking to our people if we were not really participating in those educational systems. They were
You
speaking
didn't
amongst
exist. You're
themselves.
extinct.
Right, right. And
They were
really
speaking to you.
that idea of classism also comes in, right? That
Yeah.
the peasants and the peons, right? The peons
Mm-hmm.
and the patrones,
Mm-hmm.
we would say the patrons or those people. So if there's a large segment of the population that is not accessing that education, that history that they're imparting over and over to each other, recirculating amongst each other, is just their view, right,
Yeah.
of what will happen there. And so,
I like how you use the term circulating because it,
right,
it, it becomes its own myth as well,
it
you
becomes
know?
its own myth. And I have another great example of that, but I just wanted to give you that example so that like, here we are, the 19th century, and it's still, there's these issues going on, and this is where it really starts with. And then um, even much earlier, we see an example, and I was just on